Can I share one thing that we do in my family in terms of mindfulness?
Please.
This is perhaps the most utilized, well-received intervention that I've shared with anybody in 20 years of working in behavioral health. Meaning of all the things, like all the books, all the resources, all the haste, try this single thing, more people have come back to me and said, that changed my life or even my family's life. And it's very simple. Like if you came to my house,
Welcome to the Stacking Habits Podcast with your hosts, David, Matthew, and Caleb. Our mission each week is to dig into the habits, rituals, and routines of guests who are living life to the fullest. But remember, knowledge without action is worthless. So be sure to take what you hear and put it into practice. Turn these words into works in your own life. Without further ado, let's dive in. Welcome back to the Stacking Habits Podcast. We've got a very interesting guest today. I'm really excited to dig into his story and some of his insights and wisdom. Today on the show, we have Dr. Adam Dell. He currently serves as the Director of Emotional Wellbeing. That's a really cool title that we'll dig into momentarily at the Notre Dame Wellness Center with Premise Health. And prior to taking this role, he served nearly 7 years as an active duty psychologist with the U.S. Air Force. So Adam, thank you for your service. And the reason we're having this conversation is we've been sort of looking for unique and interesting habits about how to build a more intentional and practical life. And so Matthew, David, and I have been sort of looking in the weeds and trying to find just unique people. And Matthew sent this Instagram reel. From the pre-show here, we understand you've been putting a lot of content together over the last few months. And Matthew said, hey guys, check this guy out. It's incredible. I think he'd make an incredible guest. I clicked the link, pull it up, and I'm like, I think I recognize this fella. I saw your name and was like, absolutely, I do. So we crossed paths a bit at Grace College in Winona Lake, Indiana. Your sister, I believe, was in my class, if not plus or minus a year. And so what a blast from the past. That was incredible. It's such a small world, and we're delighted to have you on the show. So welcome.
So how does the Instagram success feel? Were you expecting some of those reels to pop off? Is that why you were posting those? Were you just posting lectures, little bits and pieces from your classes, or how did that kind of happen on Instagram?
Yeah. So I didn't have an Instagram account prior to about 3 months ago. And I had a chance to speak to the student body at Wheaton College in the spring of this year and was approached by a kid that was about ready to graduate. And he's like, hey, I've got a media company. If you ever want to grow a social media presence to write a book or get more speaking gigs or whatever. So anyway, he and his team of 20-year-olds created these accounts for me on TikTok and Instagram and helped my LinkedIn profile look a little better. And so, yeah, they've posted the last couple of months, just random stuff that's been recorded.
Nice. And then you have that, I think the one video I saw had at least 1 million views or more than that when I last saw it, right?
Yeah. So interestingly, I had actually reached out to Gabe, who he's in charge of media, Myers Media is his company. I told him the week of Thanksgiving, man, like, it's been nice. Thanks for doing this. And then it was actually that week that thing, I think it's like 1.9 million or something like that. So he's encouraged me to continue for at least a little while longer, and I'm in it now. So.
Do you have a goal with the social media, or is it really just to get more awareness around some of the emotional and psychological pieces that you like to talk about?
Yeah, it's a great question. I love to teach. I'd like to write a book or two, but mostly my profession has a terrible service delivery model, where somebody goes to school for 6 or 8 or even 10 years and spits out on the other side with a license and then meets with people individually 1 hour at a time. And the reality is globally, certainly nationally, we're reaching like unprecedented territory in terms of the prevalence of suicide and anxiety and depression. And so for me, it's like a coalescence of a little bit of teaching, although I've got a lot to learn in terms of doing it in 30 to 90 seconds, but then like casting a wider net with behavioral science, hopefully to folks that maybe have never engaged with a psychologist or a mental health professional before.
I love it.
Yeah.
Have you seen anything tangible from the social media activity? So like, have you gotten any additional speaking gigs or I guess even like thank you cards in the mail?
Yeah, there have been a couple of requests to speak or to do trainings for like various organizations. What's really been moving is just like a flood of DMs of people from all over the world saying like, could I please set up an appointment with you? Literally like all over the world, people saying, they might connect with a reel about parenting or a reel about infertility or a reel about acceptance or whatever. And that speaks to something that they're dealing with and they'll reach out. I don't have a private practice that would allow me to see people in India or wherever, but it has been a moving thing to see how many folks have said like, hey, this resonated with me. And then to be able to just offer them some insights about what kind of help might be helpful.
So are you able to essentially refer that out then, or just kind of give them just a little nugget of wisdom or something to help them on their way?
Yeah, so I've been careful to put disclaimers up on these pages that, I'm not dispensing something approximating therapy, although, I think of behavioral science as maybe not the bricks, but the mortar. It can be applied pretty generally and universally to any individual, family, group, organization to help strengthen and hold it together. So I hope it's therapeutic, the stuff that people can interact with. But yeah, I'm largely just sharing with folks like, here's what the clinical literature has to say about what kind of therapy or meds or combination of the two might be helpful so that they can kind of vector in that direction.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
I'm sure you've gotten multiple requests to speak on podcasts too.
Yeah, there have been a handful. I mean, again, I never had these platforms until late summer, really. I think the team has helped me put together 50 videos in the last couple of months. So I've done a lot of podcast and this type of work with my full-time gig, but yeah, I hope it'll just open more doors and then hopefully, I'll have something meaningful to contribute. So it's an honor to be here with you guys. I told David last week, it's like, if nothing lands that feels like it's meaningful and you don't share this with anybody, that's okay. But yeah, really happy to be here. Just very honored to be able to share a little bit.
Well, David said he was shedding a few tears in the pre-call. So if that's any indication of what we can expect today, I have no doubt it will be a very
cool.
I was going to say delicious. I don't know if that's the right adjective, but a very quality conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, he was canning onions at the time that we spoke, as far as I understood. Yeah.
Like a likely story. So you're just up the road. I'm over in Fort Wayne still. Why don't you give us just a quick background on what you're doing and how you got there and sort of what attracts you and draws you into that emotional space?
Yeah, well, thanks again for allowing me to be here. What an honor. The most important thing about me is I'm Janin's husband and Addie and Amelia's dad. Prior to becoming their biological father, my wife and I were foster parents in 3 different states during my military career for about 10 years of infertility and just like a real struggle and inability to get pregnant. I've found as a psychologist the prevalence of infertility issues for committed couples is a lot higher than maybe what some might suspect. So sometimes I share that so that those who may be listening might understand they're not alone in that journey. And it was a me issue. I just had a really low sperm count. And so it was like a miraculous thing that we would get pregnant with Adeline. And then her sister was born 7 months ago. Yeah, and I also am a psychologist, which means I went to school for a long time. I have a terminal doctoral degree, which just means that I know almost everything there is to know about almost nothing. And my little shred of almost nothing is clinical psychology. I wouldn't be able to change the oil in my car, but I could ask you how that makes you feel. So anyway, I lead a team at the University of Notre Dame. What a cool place. And we provide sort of multifaceted, multidisciplinary healthcare opportunities for faculty and staff and their benefit eligible family members there. So there's a separate kind of university counseling center that works with students. But I work with primary care doctors, pediatricians, physical therapists, a pharmacy, wellness coaches, social workers, chronic condition management nurses, et cetera. and another couple of psychologists and students that are studying to become psychologists there at Notre Dame. I loved working in the United States Air Force, and I love working at a place like the University of Notre Dame because healthcare in these settings is almost free. And so it's really accessible. I also love these settings because most of the people we're working with are pretty darn average or above average. They're a lot like anybody that might be listening to this podcast. They're employed, they're not addicted to methamphetamine. They're bright, they're well educated, they're motivated. And so as a clinical psychologist, although we're probably trained to tell people better what's wrong with them than what's right with them, these types of settings allow us to not only ameliorate human suffering, but also certainly to help people to walk in the direction of flourishing, which I think is much more important. So yeah, that's what I do during the week when I'm not playing with the girls or hanging out with my wife.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Flourishing is a very good word. Again, our show is primarily about habits and trying to be as practical as possible. And as glamorous as it is to have the ice bath out back or the red light sauna and brag about some of these healthy habits that we have, I think emotional well-being sort of takes a back seat until it's broken. And in a lot of ways, it's just like our healthcare system at large. We don't really go in and do a lot of prophylactic or preventative care. We just wait till something breaks and then we react to it. So that's going to kind of set the stage for what, at least me personally, I'd love to dig in and follow my curiosity is for those that, aren't necessarily broken or at the point where they need therapy or they've been diagnosed with PTSD, and just the average person that's trying to flourish and better their life. Let's just set the stage there. You mentioned that we're sort of coming up on an epidemic. I think that was the word you used pre-show in terms of emotional health and well-being. So can you kind of walk us through where we are primarily in the US, but maybe globally as well? And then we'll kind of dig into some of the habits and pieces from there.
Sure. Yeah. Well, there's no mistake about it. The World Health Organization now estimates that depression is the leading cause of disability globally. And all of the things that we might track in terms of rates of PTSD, depression, anxiety, substance use disorders, all of them have only been exacerbated in the context of the pandemic and, circumstances thereafter. And so I read an article recently that for adolescents, and we're seeing some of the largest increases in anxiety and depression and suicidality in people in America between the ages of 15 and 25. Like the average level of neuroticism for that age group, neuroticism meaning anxiety or depression, is about what you would have found in a psychiatric hospital in the 1970s. So it's not really a matter of like, is this a phenomenon, man? It is. And sort of the etiological pathways, like how we got there, I think could be about 15 of these podcasts in terms of what might suck up some of the variants that explains how a culture like ours would be so increasingly fearful, so increasingly dysphoric or melancholic and hopeless. But yeah, I mean, like that's sort of like globally, nationally, like 800,000 people a year across the globe die by suicide each year. And so these are things that affect any one of us personally. And even if we wouldn't put ourselves in that category of broken, which by the way, like having been a psychologist with fighter pilots or, coaches, people in athletics or, individuals in really prominent places, even in a place as amazing as a place like the University of Notre Dame, I am reminded again and again that even the best of people are people at best. And trauma is cumulative over time, like exposure to adversity. Eventually, like there's a greater and greater weight that's carried with that until we get pretty wounded. So, I think all of us experience like a full range of psychiatric symptoms. I've never met anyone that had no anxiety or no depression. And so, yeah, as your listeners are listening and leaning in, it's sort of like, yeah, even if I can't exactly relate to that, someone I love or care for has really experienced sort of the darkest night of their soul recently, or suffers in some of these ways. And so I think taking the opportunity to do things like this, as we mentioned pre-show, just feels like a privilege, man, because, it would take me 3 hours just to talk to the three of you guys for 1 hour each in my day job. And so if there's even 15, 20, 30, 40 people that listen to this podcast, it would take me an entire week to meet with them each individually, 1 hour at a time. There's got to be a better service delivery method to blast some of this information about not only coping with difficult things, but also like how to keep building a meaningful life.
That's fantastic. So I'm going to keep using the healthcare analogy to physical health, because I think it just provides enough of a latch to sort of catch and hold on to here. You can go get, CT scans or MRIs, and maybe not CT. I think there's too much radiation with that, but you can go in and get diagnostic imaging, and they can start, detecting things like early signs of cancer or, liver disease or organ disease. Are there any equivalents when it comes to the emotional side of things, in terms of tests? Or I know mindfulness and meditation has been kind of getting a new life lately, but are there some things that as listeners are kind of honing in going, I wonder if some of these things are impacting me, or maybe they are? How do you go about sort of finding your way to that and recognizing it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say our science is really in its infancy. I wish that, like, similar to diabetes or something, you could just draw a hemoglobin A1C or some lab test and say, oh, you've got generalized anxiety disorder or extreme handsome disorder or something like that. We're not there. And really our diagnostic system is, one of my reels that I've gotten some heat. I got some heat from others from various disciplines, just kind of pointing out that our diagnostic and statistical manual has a lot of work that needs done. There's hundreds of thousands of different combinations of symptoms, for example, that each would be labeled PTSD. And so if you've got a line of 200,000 people who all have a different set of symptoms, but they all get the same label, it's like, what are we describing there? I would say this: any mental health professional worth their salt, I think, will pretty quickly help people to start recognizing maybe not just sort of the things that hurt that bring them in terms of I've got, this much anxiety or depression, but also the way in which that's getting in the way of really important functional domains in their life. We tend to think about these things in terms of social, in terms of personal health and growth, in terms of occupational, and even in terms of something like existential, meaning and purpose oriented. I think like any mental health professional that's worth talking to more than once is eventually going to start helping anybody to start recognizing how avoidance has increasingly kind of creeped in, and the costs associated with avoiding things that we may remember, avoiding circumstances that make us sad or anxious, avoiding, fears of what might come into the future. So that, to your point, mindfulness is sometimes, I think, a profoundly misunderstood construct. There's so many different camps associated with what mindfulness might be. I tend to think of mindfulness as drawing my attention on purpose in a fluid way to something here and now so that I could be more aware of and participative with it. And so much of the psychiatric distress that I'll see as a clinical psychologist does not come from that kind of attentional awareness. It oftentimes comes from a preoccupation and a haunting of things that came before, or almost like a paralysis about what might be coming around the corner. And it really robs us of the opportunity to be here and now, which is the only place that we have freedom.
So, Adam, let's dig a little bit into mindfulness. Our minds have the ability, and maybe it's a problem, to look at the past and dwell in shame. We also have the ability and propensity to look into the future and wonder what is going to come around the corner. And it gets very difficult at times to sort of focus in and just be there. I know I feel that with my kids. I feel that even on podcast recording, my mind is flashing forward to, what's going to be there for dinner. So have you found some really good practices for people to sort of hone in on the present? And then what do you do with the thoughts and the feelings and everything else that sort of emerges when you do that?
Yeah. Well, man, I think that's a brilliant question. And I think it's neat that there's 4 guys on this call right now, because I've found that men in general, whether it was Marines and soldiers and airmen and sailors that I worked with in Department of Defense or other, I mean, there's like people in the fire department, police department, athletics department at Notre Dame. I see a lot of men in therapy, and I'm not sure that we're very good either at being very present or at knowing what in the world to do with painful thoughts or emotions, And so, frankly, we live in a culture that allows us many, many expedient, wildly effective strategies for avoiding that kind of thing. The average American spends over 4 hours a day on their phone doing non-work related tasks. And, like how many people in my career have hired alcohol, for example, myself included, after a 2016 deployment. You come back from something like that. I had a good colleague of mine kill himself there. I was a medic on call, responded to the scene, found him. And what I found was 6 to 8 shots of gin right before bed. And then I didn't have to think much about it, and I certainly wouldn't dream about it. So we hire various strategies to try to be mindless. This is also perhaps one of the reasons why 70% of American adults are overweight or obese, because of a total lack of awareness, like a total lack of present connectedness to even like how elbow deep I am in the Pringles can. And so, like sometimes people conjure this idea of mindfulness as this like Zen kind of Buddhist, like cross your legs and sit in the grass and focus on your breath. And there's actually a terrific amount of empirical support for that. That's actually quite helpful. But, I think like most of my training and most of what I do as a dad or as somebody who's lost 60 pounds just in the last year using these things, or as a husband or as a psychologist, comes from the acceptance and commitment therapy literature. Or even, like if your listeners are into good books, like Stephen Hayes wrote the best book. I got an email from him this week. He's like a hero of mine. I asked him if I could publish a book and cite some of his stuff, and he actually responded to me. I think his best book was written just a couple of years ago called A Liberated Mind: How to Pivot Towards What Matters. It's a terrific book. If your listeners don't have all the time to read that big thing, I would just focus on part 2. He's got a whole chapter in there on mindfulness. I think also like Ellen Langer at Harvard is known by some as the mother of mindfulness. And she published a book this year called The Mindful Body. That will blow you away in terms of how we think directly correlates to like how good our eyes work, how good our ears work, like whether or not we recover from illness. But she's also just done some brilliant stuff in terms of mindfulness related to decision making. So long story short, I think, Caleb, like when I do this right, and let me just say, I've never met anybody who is mindful all the time, but all of us could be a little bit more mindful. And so I think about like taking back a few seconds or minutes every day in times that really, really matter. So like a quick personal example is I lost 60 pounds in the last year or so, partly because I was inspired by becoming a father twice over and being old and recognizing like I want to be able to play with my kids when they're still young enough that they live in my house, but I'm in my 50s. And when I'm approaching 60 at a high school graduation, right, I don't want to be there if I can help it with a poor health status. But also in part by just drawing attention to what I was eating instead of just mindlessly going into a pantry or grazing, drawing attention to the here and the now, even in writing down, hey, it's 1400 on Friday afternoon, and I'm going to eat a handful of almonds, instead of just mindlessly and kind of bombing around the house and eating things and having no idea at the end of the day what I consumed. Mindfulness also helped me to realize like I was telling myself stories and living in autopilot about how often I would drink alcohol, that it was just, well, it's Friday. I always drink on Fridays. And so part of mindfulness, I think, is being aware of our thoughts without needing our thoughts to change. I could talk for a long time about mindfulness, but I think sometimes it's helpful to dispel the wrong ideas people have about mindfulness. Like, for example, mindfulness is not relaxation. In fact, mindfulness, when done well, especially in a time of difficulty, turns the volume up in some ways on painful thoughts, emotions, memories, and bodily sensations. Like, we become aware of them without trying to avoid them. Mindfulness is also not like emptying our heads of thoughts, but I think it allows us to separate ourselves a little bit as a thinker from a particular thought. Like one of the most powerful things that I encourage people to do in therapy from a mindfulness-based standpoint is when they're starting to notice that they're getting angry, for example, or they're getting frustrated, to simply just say out loud, like, I'm noticing that I'm getting angry again. Or if it's a thought that comes, you mentioned shame, right? And like, everybody on this call and everybody that's listening to this has some version in their head and heart about the I'm not good enough story that we've carried around with us since we were probably 5, that maybe didn't even originate in our own heads, but came externally to us from people that we should have been able to count on as caregivers or friends. And when I notice the I'm not good enough thing, I'm not smart enough, I'm not good enough, I'm an imposter, or whatever that is, to just simply say, like, I'm telling myself the story again that I'm not going to be bright enough to be able to contribute anything meaningful on a podcast like this, right? Like, I'd be kidding you if I didn't hear from that part of my mind when I'm connecting to this 3 minutes late, And it's like, I don't need that to go away in order for me to be able to change my relationship to it, to recognize that this is a part of my mind that flashes up that largely is just trying to keep me safe. I'll just say one final thing. When I'm able to feel fully and think fully without needing to hire something to help me go into avoidance mode, then what that means is that even the deepest, darkest thoughts and emotions that I have are just signposts to significance in my heart. And here's what I mean by that. And I've stolen this from Susan David, who's also at Harvard. She wrote a terrific book called Emotional Agility. Checking In with Susan David is her podcast. She's brilliant, easy to listen to, grew up in South Africa, nice accent. She talks about how emotions are just indicators to values. So like, as we're all sort of thinking about this through the lens of our own lived experience, it's kind of like, what's the thing that I've worried about the most in the last week? And if I can be aware of it and then ask myself, like, what does that tell me that I care about? Well, all of a sudden now I'm not just a person who's feeling anxious or insecure. I'm connected to something like, man, I want to do something about human suffering in this world. Or like, I want to be competent and use some of the privilege of my own life in terms of education, clinical experience, to be able to offer something meaningful to the world. All of a sudden now, instead of just being an insecure person who's mostly thinking about male pattern baldness and how much shine's going to be on my head for the podcast, all of a sudden now I'm connected to things like courage, values like compassion, and I'm able to like build a meaningful life.
In defense of the bald dome, you do have a killer beard, so that is something of envy. Man, Adam, you just gave a lot of information, and it really connected in a lot of ways. I love that concept of signposts of significance. Let me try and rephrase the mindfulness piece, because that's still something that is new for me. So I'm trying to come at it a different way, and mindfulness just sort of has this nebulous kind of I don't want to say foo-foo, but it's an overused term. So when I hear that and try and let it sit with me, the other words that come to mind are sort of just being aware of what's going on. The idea of simply observing. So we always, I tend to cast judgment and say, hey, I'm feeling anxious. That's bad. I don't want to feel anxious. How do I stop? And instead of that, just step back and say, oh, I'm observing that I'm anxious. And then get curious. I wonder why that is. And I wonder what that reveals about my values. Is that maybe a better way to sort of phrase that?
That's certainly one way to do mindfulness, Caleb. Like the next time you're frustrated with your wife, if you were able to take a breath and say, what does this anger tell me that I care about? For many of the people that I work with, and I'm not suggesting that you and your wife have some high conflict dynamic going on, but for in my marriage anyway, when I'm feeling the most frustrated with my wife, it usually traces down to something in my heart, like I'd like to be respected. And the invitation then is to step in with the very next thing that I do or say as a man who's respectable. But if I don't get down there, then the next thing that I do or say comes from a person who's just wounded. Now, like, that's one form of mindfulness, and that's extremely cognitive. If someone came to me and they said, like, I'm addicted to porn, for example, or I'd like to lose weight, or I'd like to quit smoking, or I've developed some kind of a compulsive or addictive type habit and it's ruining my life, I would not initially tell them you should do less of that thing, partly because anytime we tell a human being that from ages 5 to 95, they just come up with 25 reasons why they should. All I'm going to ask somebody to do is to start engaging in more mindful awareness of when and how much they're using that particular stimulus. So it's like, I don't want you to stop looking at porn 1 minute less in the next week. Or if you smoke a pack a day, smoke your 20 cigarettes. All I'm going to ask you to do, ideally in real time, not like at the end of the day by recollection, but in a little pad of paper in your pocket or whatever, I just want you to start writing down when you're turning to this thing, like what time and how long. So you might say 14:13, Friday afternoon, 1 cigarette. Got it. What's so fascinating about this, and like for any, geeks that listen to your podcast that are really curious about like empirically supported things, or what does the research say? I mean, like mindfulness benefits almost anything that could be measured, from immune system functioning to certainly mental health symptoms like anxiety or depression. People who are more mindful in a cockpit, for example, as a former active duty Air Force psychologist, have a higher ceiling for performance. Like when people are able to engage in these things tactically, they become the best versions of themselves and perhaps experience the most out of life. Like if you think about the last time that you were really connected to something that was novel, that you were participating in and consumed by, it's like time slows down. And like, who the heck wouldn't want that? Whether you're eating a bowl of ice cream or making love to your intimate partner or playing with your kid in the backyard or listening to your favorite song. It's like, how could I be more present with this without like getting pulled to the past or the future? And what's fascinating about mindfulness, by just simply drawing our attention to when things are occurring, is regardless of the target behavior, like whatever the thing is you're trying to eradicate, there's usually about a 50% reduction in that behavior just by doing that. Because like, here's what happens. People start realizing like, oh man, I just had a cigarette like 8 minutes ago and I don't want to write this down again. Like, do I really need one? Nah, I don't think so. It's like, they'll do that 50% of the time. People will come back into my office a week later and they'll be like, all of a sudden, right? It's not cigarettes using me, it's me using cigarettes. And all of a sudden now, like in this space between I'm present and aware of this and able to be participative with it, and whatever the behavior is, I found like a lot of freedom in there and freedom to choose. And so it like bolsters agency and allows us to feel like maybe we're able to kind of wield our volitionality a little bit more.
Love that.
In the topic of mindfulness, I'm curious how much of the environment shapes the behavior and I guess encourages certain behaviors. For example, a few weeks ago, I saw my favorite cookie from childhood, the uncooked dough, and you bake cookies, and we have a toaster oven. And so for the last week and a half, I've been baking 2 cookies every night, eating them. And I know they're not the best for me, but they're delicious. And I've never eaten so many cookies in my life. And I feel like I could continue to eat these cookies forever as long as they're in my refrigerator. Thankfully, I'm down to like my last 8 cookies. But, we also spoke previously about how Fridays are protected or sacred for you. Fridays are family time for your kids. And you make that expectation clear whenever you're taking a new job. And so, how important is environment in aiding behaviors and in aiding creating a space for mindfulness?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, David. There's a book that's a little old now. It's called Mindless Eating, I think. I can double check for you. By Wansink. Yeah. Mindless Eating by Wansink. Man, this thing, like the overweight and obesity epidemic in most of the developed Western world can largely be traced to things like ultra processed foods, which typically comprise about 60 to 80% of Americans' diets, even little kids. And that's horrifying. And portion sizes. And Wan Singh's book is full of these just like amazing examples of how if you put someone in the right environment and even serve them something which tastes like garbage, if it's in a larger container, they'll eat way more of it. I think that we as humans, especially in Western culture where there are still these like very almost immutable tenets of rugged individualism and this idea that we become what we choose. I think that we oftentimes wrongly misunderstand and undervalue the impact of environment on the choices that we make and the things that we wear, the things that we eat, the people or the things that we spend our time focused on. And so in that way, right? Again, is anybody mindful all the time? No way. Could we all be a little bit more mindful in terms of the things that really matter in our life? I'll share another book with you, maybe in part because I do this all the time as a psychologist too. I don't know. When I was really junior as a psychologist, I shared resources all the time, probably because 90% of the reason was I was insecure. It is like, don't take my word for it. Like, now it's just like, I mean, yeah, I think like if you listen to a podcast once, it could be insightful. If you have a book, you might have that forever. You go back to it and that sort of thing. But one of the things that can be really powerful. Oh my God, I just lost it. Sorry. Hopefully you edit this out. What were we talking about?
We were talking about mindless eating, and you were recommending some books there, and then you were bringing up another book and pointing to them and saying,
about
hey,
environment and how it affects.
Well, there's certainly a really great book by Chip and Dan Heath called Switch.
Love it.
That talks a lot about how to engage in behavior change. And there's 3 elements to that, but the path piece is definitely the environment. And I think that is perhaps one of the most insightful books. It's not written for clinical psychologists that I think really illuminates how critical it is if you want to start and maintain a change. And then certainly James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, he has an entire chapter on there about how really kind of the environment is so influential that, if we don't shape that a little bit, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. Another book that I was going to mention that I just remembered is from Peter Attia, or Attia. That book, honestly, in the last year is probably the most profound book that I've read for my own personal development. And that in that book, he talks about 4 pillars of health: nutritional biochemistry, exercise science, sleep enhancement, and emotional well-being. And so, like when I think about individuals wanting to try to pursue mindfulness in any particular area, I just try to think about like, well, what would be a meaningful thing that we could create a pathway process for that would make the biggest difference that you can do and that you would be willing to do today. And any one of these books that I've talked about, or, even a close friend or a psychologist, therapist, whatever, somebody that cares for you, that can help you to create the path and then help hold you accountable to it. It's amazing like what a human being can do when they're just a little bit more aware and they get out of autopilot kind of one day at a time.
I think that's really a commercial for what we're after with this entire podcast. We've talked about creating a habit menu, and sort of the idea is to cast a wide net, because most people, when they think habits, they're thinking, at least in the business world, are thinking, how do I be more efficient? How do I be, how do I get same thing, but more done in a day, more productive? And, how can I get a 6-pack or, whatever goals that you may have? And a lot of times we just have too narrow of a frame, and we miss out on the fact that there's so many other potential habits that could help us. And so really our main criteria for guests is that they are intentional. And I think that word is about as spot on as it can be with you and what we're discussing here. I think mindfulness is being intentional and saying, hey, I want to just look at my life and take an unemotional view of my own life, be curious about it, and just observe, and then pick some things to do based on that. And Socrates has a quote. I went to a nerdy high school and we studied Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all those. He had a great quote that has stuck with me since high school. And it's, the unexamined life is not worth living. And I love that. It's like, if you're not going to be intentional and you're just going to go on autopilot, as you called it, I think we just skate through life and we don't ever hit the brakes and kind of zoom out and say, hey, am I living a life that I'm proud of? Something Alex Hormozy says is, do the things today that future you would be proud of. So don't do things to win an Olympic medal, or don't do things to, make $1 million, whatever your goals may be. Simply break that down and say, what would future Caleb be proud of? And that really informs decisions. I find that when I'm looking for meaning in the fridge or the pantry and I'm about to grab, some potato chips, and I go, would future Caleb want me to eat these potato chips right now? And the answer usually is no. He would not be happy with that decision. And I guess that's sort of mindfulness as well, and just being aware of it.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I think like there is no self-compassion or wise living without mindfulness. In fact, any theory of self-compassion or wise living necessarily includes this. Certainly Kristen Neff's model comes to mind. And like within the acceptance and commitment therapy framework and what I do with people, sometimes we will engage in sort of self as context exercises where people will do perspective taking, like, what do you think your older self would think about this now? And I've oftentimes found, even with some of the toughest, service members or people who are truly alpha, like truly win all the time, always leading, which is intensely lonely and very costly, but they're extraordinary at it. It's amazing to me how many people get reduced to tears when they do that kind of perspective taking based on a much younger version of themselves. It's like, how old were you? Or how tall were you? Or what kind of clothes did you wear? Or what was your hair like when you started hiring food to comfort you? Or when you started believing that you weren't good enough? And like one of the fascinating things in therapy sometimes, in a mindful connected moment like that, is kind of like, if that young kid had the ability to see you now, what would you want him to see? And it's careful to phrase it that way, right? Because it's not like, what do you think he would see? Because then people get pretty judgmental, but like, what would you want him to see in your being and doing? Like in the kind of father that you are, in the kind of nutrition that you put in your body, in the types of things you scroll to at 1 a.m. on your phone, like in terms of the quality of your relationships, like the deep friendships that Aristotle talked about, not just kind of transactional relationships, in your ability to play, learn, grow. Like, what would you want him to see? Or what would you want for somebody else that you cared a lot for? Like someone that you really cared for, that you really cared about what happened next to them. What would you want them to do with alcohol? What would you want them to do with these things? And it just can be such a powerful catalyst to starting to say, like, I think that I could start disobeying my mind a little bit. That's a phrase from ACT as well. Like, I'll give you an example of this. I've got a history of overeating, because I'm an American probably, and we venerate overeating in some ways. But, like on a particularly difficult day for therapy sometimes, like I've got my own trauma history. I sit down with somebody and they tell me some of the hell of their own history. And it was just like almost clockwork. I would hit a fast food restaurant on the way home, zip through the drive-through, a couple of double cheeseburgers or whatever. Always knew, probably in some level, that wasn't a great idea. Would even have ambivalence about it in the drive-through, but it was like, I'm doing it, And like one of the things that I'll encourage people to do sometimes is like, if they've hired certain things like that to comfort them and they've told themselves the story, like, yeah, like, I deserve this or I need this or whatever. It's like the next time you feel that way, go to the drive-through, order your favorite meal, take one bite and throw the rest of it away. Like disobey your mind in a present, connected, choice-oriented moment to be able to say, I don't have to listen to the story that I have to eat all of this thing. I can take a bite of it and get rid of it, right? Like, David, you don't have to eat the rest of those 8 cookies, man. That's a story in your head. And so it's like, you go home and eat all 8 cookies if you want, man. I'm not the cookie police, but like, wouldn't it be something, right? If it was like, well, what if I made these delicious cookies tonight and I took one bite And then I threw the rest away. Not because like, it's like, I love me, I hate me, I love me, I hate me, or anything like that. But it's just like, I get to make some choices here. Like I get to be more aware of and participative with this with a lot more freedom. And, like I think when I was first learning about some of this stuff, I oftentimes thought about this, even like in terms of with my spouse, like in eye contact, like married for a number of years, like what would it be like for me to take 3 seconds of mindful connection to just notice something unique or different about her eyes, or what it feels like to hold her hand, or what it sounds like to hear her breathing after she fell asleep. Like, how could I be a little bit more aware of, appreciative, and even grateful for, some of the stuff that typically I might understand as a stimulus nearby, but not really pay much attention to. Can I share one thing that we do in my family in terms of mindfulness?
Please.
This is perhaps the most utilized, well-received intervention that I've shared with anybody in 20 years of working in behavioral health. Meaning of all the things, like all the books, all the resources, all the haste, try this single thing, more people have come back to me and said, that changed my life or even my family's life. And it's very simple. Like if you came to my house, there's, over a dozen of these all over the house. In fact, there's a couple, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but there's like 4 years worth of them back there. Dr. Laurie Santos at Yale teaches a class on gratitude. She's got like a similar exercise in there. You can take that class for free. It's the most well-attended course in Yale history. This thing will sit in a prominent place in our house. And it sits in a prominent place so that we're visually cued that, all this is important to us. And there's lots of little strips of paper next to it. And every year we start a new jar. And at the beginning of the year in January, at some point, either my wife or I, or now our 4-year-old, will think, oh, I'm grateful for something in particular, jot it down with a date, fold it up and stick it in there. And over the course of a year, man, they get pretty full. And so, like if you were in my office, we could go back there and find one that says like 2007. Sometimes like we find what we're looking for. And cognitive science teaches us that we will encode in more specificity and detail negative events than positive ones. And so like if we want to cultivate a habit like gratitude, then like this is a really approachable way to do it. By the way, I've had a lot of men in my office that have felt like they've sort of lost their voice, their influence with their family and kids. Maybe they work outside the home a lot. Maybe they are not as present during their kids' formative years. Mom kind of takes the reins in terms of how things go at home. I've challenged a lot of dads over my career, or a lot of husbands, to think about around a dinner table or when giving a blessing over a meal, or like, how might you champion a gratitude-oriented mindfulness type exercise where for a moment you're able to pause and notice something? And what's really interesting is like when you start something like this, it's pretty easy. It's like, I'm thankful for my wife, but like, I'm not going to put that in twice, right? So like, you can bet the one that's upstairs in my house, it's going to be like, one of mine is going to say, today's date, Caleb, David, Matthew, this podcast is special to spend some time. And so it's a meaningful thing to do in the here and the now. It's an overjoyful thing to do at the end of the year to spill out the contents. But I'll tell you, like, when trauma or grief or hardship visits your life, to know that you have established a decade or more worth of a habit, right? Like, when calamity visits our home next, because it's not a matter of if, but when. And I'm tempted to believe that life is all bad, that there's only room to despair. I've got like a jar back there that says 2010, and I could empty that out on the floor with tears streaming down my face and be reminded of things that I didn't even think of for a long time that were connected to meaning and joy and beauty and art and music and love. And it can be like such a centering process for us. So don't like get too wooey about mindfulness. I think mindfulness could be approached in the same way that many of your listeners have actually cultivated different habits in terms of being successful professionally. I check my email this number of times. I exercise this number of times a week. I do these things. And it's like, what if I were to be a little bit more present and aware and participative with something even as simple but profoundly impactful as gratitude. And what if I got to lead my family in that as well? It's like an experiment, maybe worth trying.
I think it's definitely worth trying. Well, Adam, thank you so much for coming. I feel like we could talk for hours, and I don't know what our policy is on repeat guests, but we may need to have you back at some point in the future as this thing continues to grow. But mindfulness and mason jars may be the subtitle here. I really appreciate you coming on. I'm glad you were kind of anti social media, or just didn't have it up until the last few months, and that's been blowing up. So I'm glad Matthew found you. I'm glad we got to reconnect here. For those that want to follow you, I've got your Instagram up. Is that where you're mostly hanging out?
Yeah, that's a great place to go.
So we will link to that in show notes, but it is Dr. Dell. So ADAM, just like the first man, and then Dell, DELL. And then it looks like you also have dradamdell.com as well.
That's it. Yes,
perfect. Yeah. So again, I don't think you run a private practice, right? You probably can't pick up clients necessarily from this.
No, up to this point, I've responded to every message on there, not to offer therapy. But yeah, I stay pretty busy, and I think like part of being the dad and the husband that I want to need to be means that I've got pretty strict limits about where the clinical stuff begins and ends, but always happy to consult or nudge people in the direction of a resource or a particular modality for care.
I love that. And you also mentioned several books on this podcast. Yeah. We will link to those in the show notes as well. So until next time, be a little more mindful, be a little more intentional. And Dr. Dell, thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks, guys.